to be a Formula One fan in the United States, especially since the 1980s, has been a damn near impossible task. So one of the reasons why I created this channel was to provide a perspective of Formula One through the eyes of an American, right? An American who has been watching Formula One since the mid-1980s, which actually is kind of a rare breed nowadays. We just don't really see that anymore. So again, I'm dating myself, but again, been able to stick around with the sport for a long time, so it's been really good. But the other day I was watching a video about why Formula One is not or is popular or whatever in the United States. And it was done by some guy in like Norway or Sweden or Denmark or something like that, and was talking about how Formula One's business model is and talking about the NBA and this, that, and the other. And it was just all over the place, and I honestly had no earthly clue what he was talking about. To me, to understand how Formula One has evolved in the United States, you really have to have an understanding of the broadcast history of Formula One. Something can only become popular in a country if people have the ability to watch it. And that has been a very big challenge for a lot of people in the United States over the last 30, 40 years. So today what we're going to do is this video, strap yourself in, it's going to be a little bit long. This video is going to be about the history of broadcasting of Formula One in the United States and kind of through my eyes, my perspective of Formula One during this whole entire time. So we're going to start even before I was born and then work into the 80s, 90s, and come all the way to today. So you can kind of give an idea of how difficult it was for somebody who is a Formula One fan to really watch Formula One in the United States. And we're going to start in the 70s with this company right here, ABC. So a lot of you from overseas, you might know CBS, NBC, ABC. These were the big three networks. So back in the late 1970s, there were no Formula One rights in the United States, or at least it was very, very loose. And you had this show called Wide World of Sports. And basically what it did is it just showed like little bits of certain sports from around the world. So for example, I would say like, here's a rodeo competition. Here's an ice skating competition. Here's a man carrying a log competition. It was like either like real legitimate international competition or like something that you just see some obscure type of video for. And Formula One was thrown in this. Now, sometimes they showed almost an entire race, but all these races were tape delayed. So let's say you want to watch the Monaco Grand Prix. At this time, it would be on at, let's say, 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday. It wouldn't be carried live. And they didn't carry a whole entire season, so you really couldn't follow Formula One. At this time, there was no internet, so you couldn't just go on and read articles about it. Basically, in the late 70s, and even part of the early 80s, ABC Sports was all you had. Now, we did have the US Grand Prix during those times, and that would either be on ABC Sports, but sometimes it was on NBC. Sometimes it was broadcast by like some local small company out of Detroit. I have to find that video because it was just weird and obscure. So I think you know what I'm getting at here, which is there was no consistency in Formula One. It wasn't like the NFL at that time where you can just turn on, and this was kind of interesting, you turn on NBC back in the early 80s, you would get the AFC games. You turn on CBS in the early 80s, you'd get the NFC games. And if for you who don't know anything about the NFL, just Google it, right? So there was a consistency. You're able to watch football in the United States. You knew when the games were, you knew where they were going to be, you knew what times they were going to be. This consistency did not exist in Formula One, not at all. It was very inconsistent. So it was a very hard sport to follow. So then in the 1980s, things started to change, and a few things started to change. First of all, you were starting to get cable television, and with cable television, one of the first channels that we had, along with the Weather Channel and CNN, was this one, ESPN. So this was the first all sports network, right? So in the early days of ESPN, the early 80s, we started seeing Formula One. I believe maybe 1984 might have been around the first year that Formula One was on ESPN. And what's interesting about this is ESPN kind of took the wide world of sports concept and made it into a channel. So at this time, early in ESPN, they didn't really have the rights for anything. So in the early days of watching it, 81, 82, 83, it started in 1979, you would get these obscure tournaments like the bowling tournament of Northeast Ohio or some other type of tournament that like you had no interest in. Basically, ESPN was getting the rights of all these small little sports that the big networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, did not have the rights for. So NBC and CBS had the rights for the NFL. Actually, so did ABC. ABC would do the Monday Night Football game. Baseball would usually be with ABC at the time. NHL and NBA at that time, they were more local markets, right? So I grew up in Chicago, there's a channel called WFLD. This eventually became the Fox affiliate. This is where you would watch the Chicago Bulls games and the Chicago Blackhawks games. So the rights for a lot of these teams of the big sports, they were already taken. So ESPN couldn't really run with those sports. So I had to come up with all these others. But there was one that the rights weren't necessarily totally clear on. That was Formula One. So during this time, Formula One started becoming part of ESPN. Now, this was both a blessing and kind of a curse for the growth in the United States. At first, they would show certain races, and then they would eventually show all races. So when they brought the crew on, Bob Varsha, David Hobbs, Steve Matchett wasn't part of that crew. He was actually working in Formula One. Actually, this was probably before he was working in Formula One. But during this time, what you had a situation where you can actually start following the races. And some of these were tape delayed. So let's say you had the Monaco Grand Prix, might have been tape delayed till 12. And this was a good thing. You actually were able to do that. And then there was another show, which I still have now, which was Sports Center, which is just kind of an update of everything that happened in the world of sports that day. So you can watch on Sunday night, and if you missed the race, you could then see who won it or whatever. Now, one of the biggest problems during this time was that ESPN decided to make a change. And this change was both good, like really good for ESPN, but on the other hand, really bad for Formula One. So during this time, the mid-80s, we see, I believe in 1984, the launch of Speed World, which was ESPN's opportunity to kind of corner the market with all of the auto racing. So it wasn't just Formula One, it was NASCAR, it was drag racing, it was somewhat IndyCar, everything, right? They were really trying to corner the market of racing because they knew that this was a big sport that, some of the networks had rights to, for example. So CBS had the rights to the Daytona 500, but beside the Daytona 500, not many of the races in NASCAR were being watched, were being viewed because they weren't being televised nationally. They were being more televised locally. So, in fact, the first totally live 100% Daytona 500 wasn't broadcast until 1979. So that shows that we're only talking about 5 years after the first full broadcast of the Daytona 500. But during this time, ESPN brings up Speed World. And this is a great concept. It is like we're cornering this market. And part of their strategy was that they were going to have live races. I think you might know what the problem is if you're a Formula One fan. Live races all of a sudden meant that the race didn't have a replay at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No, if you lived in Chicago like I did as a child, you had to wake up at 6:30, 7 a.m. to watch a Formula One race, which was extremely inconvenient. And during this time, there were no DVRs. As I already mentioned, there was no internet. You couldn't look up the results or anything. So if you really wanted to watch a Formula One race, you had to be dedicated. You had to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, actually watch the race. Now, at this time, we did have VCRs, but anyone who grew up during this time knows that VCRs were the most unreliable things that there was. Back in 1983, I had this VCR, which was horrible. It would eat tapes. The timer wouldn't work. So the ability to actually record a Formula One race was kind of non-existent because your VCR never worked. It just never worked. It got better when it got to the late 80s, early 90s. But during this crucial time of 1984 to, let's say, 88 or 89, VCRs were just really, really, really bad. So being able to record an F1 race during this time was very difficult. Now, on the other hand, Speed Vision did show NASCAR races live. These would start at 11, 12, 1, maybe 2 in the afternoon. And what you started seeing is you started seeing the popularity of NASCAR in the United States. At that time, it had only been a regional sport in the Southeast, but having it on Sports World and bringing it to a nationwide audience really improved its ratings. And it even sucked me in. So at this time, I stopped watching Formula One more, and I started watching NASCAR more. I mean, I was a Dale Earnhardt fan. You had Dale Earnhardt, Bill Elliott, Bobby and Davey Allison. You had, Ken Schrader in the 25 Folgers car and 27 Kodiak car. You had Rusty Wallace, right? You knew these guys, and you started getting involved, and the coverage that they had was really, really, really amazing when it came to NASCAR. And so I started following NASCAR more and more and more and got really immersed in the sport. And at that time, I lost interest in Formula One. And I can't think that I'm the only one that had that situation because it was just very impossible to watch races during the 1980s because just the whole thing with no DVRs, no video recording. Well, there was video recording, but it was very unreliable. So you start seeing Formula One in the United States become less and less popular because the races were live. And nowadays we sit there and say, oh, that's great that the races are live. But the technology back then, for races on at 7 a.m., not necessarily the best. And you have to remember, too, that during this time, with the exception of maybe a race in Japan and then in the United States, that this was primarily a very, very heavy European calendar, which means that almost all races were starting at 7 a.m., which made it impossible. Now, over the years, what we saw is we saw the improvement of the VCR and other things. So people started watching it more, people started recording it more, people were getting their timers correct. But even in the early 90s, even when Senna died in 1994, Formula One still wasn't gaining ground because ESPN was still showing these races on live, right? So some of them were recorded, tape delayed for another time, but it was mostly, if you didn't wake up at 7 o'clock, you didn't see the race. If you didn't see the race, you couldn't follow the sport. If you couldn't follow the sport, you lost interest. You watch NASCAR. You watch the NFL. You watch whatever is coming along. And when ESPN started doing this, Formula One in the early 80s started being put on the back burner because not only did you have NASCAR, you also had something called the USFL, which was a rival football league to the NFL, which they're revitalizing right now in the United States. I don't know how that will go. But if you ever want to find out something that Donald Trump also ruined, go look at what he did with the USFL. It's a really interesting story. But with that being said, yeah, Formula One was just very low on the priority list. So you can see at this point why it's not popular, because if you have something that's almost impossible to watch and you can't get information for it, then how are you going to watch it, right? But then in the early 90s, and I mentioned 1994, we start seeing a change. And what is that change? The internet, which means you can go online and you can get news about the drivers. You can get news about what's happening in the sport. You actually were able to do some research. You're able to at least be a little connected to the sport. And at this time, ESPN had created their own website. You could go on, look at results, get news about whatever is happening in Formula One. Even though it was only a little bit of news because the internet was still in its infancy, you could still get some news nonetheless, right? So you saw Formula One start to evolve over the years and start getting to a point where it starts becoming popular again. Now, for me, after my really kind of long hiatus from really following Formula One, now I did follow it but it was more passively because you just couldn't actively follow it. I was really into NASCAR in the 80s and the early 90s. But I remember in 1996, I watched the Australian Grand Prix, 1996, where Martin Brundle had his big shunt right at the beginning of the race. And I realized, yeah, I need to get back to doing this. So I needed to get back to watching it. I loved the sport. I loved it when I was young. And I just really, really, really was diligent at getting back into the sport. Now, you got to remember another thing at this time, too, is that not until 1995, 1996, yes, we had the internet, but we didn't have any other publications. So Autosport magazine didn't really come to the United States until the mid-90s, right? And even getting your hands on the latest copy of Autosport was very difficult. F1 Racing magazine, as it was called back then, very hard to get your hands on, but eventually you started seeing these things in the bookstore. You started seeing things in Barnes & Noble's, Borders, if any of you remember those, Book Stop and other places. You started seeing these things. So you were able to get more involved with Formula One because you're able to read magazines, you're able to get on the internet. You got some more interest in the sport. Yes, it was still live, but you can actually keep up with the news, which meant you really didn't mind getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning to watch it because you were able to follow the sport even when you're not watching the race. And on top of that, VCRs were getting better. You can go ahead and record it, wake up later in the day, and actually watch the race. So Formula One starts improving. Now, at the end of the 1996 season, ESPN loses the rights to Formula One, which is a tragedy because you had Bob Varsha doing the races for years. And for anyone who watches Formula One in the United States, Bob Varsha is the voice of F1. He isn't Murray Walker because I don't think anyone is Murray Walker. But if you were to say who is the voice of F1 like Murray Walker was in Britain, it would definitely be Bob Varsha. Definitely. He was gone. Others were gone. So Hobbs was gone for a little bit. They had Derek Bell, and I think in the last year with Bob Varsha, he was gone. They had Derek Daly for a year or two. He was gone. And all of a sudden, we didn't know where Formula One was going to be. It's end of 1996. We find out that Formula One is gone. It is not in the United States. So yeah, so we've gone from it being hardly on TV to being a little bit on TV with a little information to not being on TV at all, right? But then we found out, great, we are going to get Formula One in the United States. Somebody bought the rights. It was Speed Vision. Who the hell is Speed Vision? So Speed Vision was a cable channel dedicated to speed, dedicated to racing, dedicated to cars and stuff like that. And I think they had some like obscure like American Le Mans series and stuff like that. But the problem was nobody had Speed Vision, right? So here I was the night of the race trying to find a place where I could watch the Australian Grand Prix in 1997 and calling every sports bar. None of the sports bars have it. Calling any like hotel or any other place. No one had it. This was like some obscure channel that was like located in the Pacific Northwest and like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Like it was just obscure. It was just no one could find it. And then I called this one restaurant, which is a racing themed restaurant in Orlando. I lived in Orlando at the time, called Race Rock. It used to be an Italian restaurant. Then it was Race Rock. Then it was a helicopter pad. Now it's a Dave & Buster's. But anyway, I called them and they said, yes, we have Speed Vision. Now, I didn't know of it being like a sports bar. I thought it was just a restaurant, but they had Speed Vision. We were able to get there. And at 11:30 at night, we see the start of the race. And I was really worried because I did not want to miss a Formula One race. I was able to catch it. But this also presented a problem, which was we couldn't watch any of the Formula One races because Speed Vision just wasn't anywhere. You couldn't get it in Florida, you couldn't get it in Chicago, you couldn't get it in LA, you couldn't get it anywhere. It was just impossible to find. Later, they realized this was a problem. They got accepted onto many of the cable companies and they were able to then broadcast Formula One. So we were able to get speed vision for the next race and watch it throughout the year. But this also gives you an idea of the importance that Bernie Ecclestone had put on the American market, because at this time they were only talking about an F1 race here, and they just really didn't give a shit who had the rights to Formula One. They didn't care that it was some small, obscure company. So how do you follow the sport when you have a sport that just doesn't even give a shit that you exist? It's hard. Now, realizing that this is a problem, Speed Vision didn't have it for long, or it did, but what happened was that Fox kind of took this over. And over the next few years, you start seeing these races on all of these Fox affiliates, right? So you start seeing it on Fox World, Fox Sports Net, Fox this, Fox that. Fox had all of these channels, and Fox basically did like what the Wide World of Sports did. They would have these channels showing Australian rules football, which is fucking awesome, and on all these other sports, right? And it was great because you could actually watch sports around the world. Formula One got thrown into here, but the way that Fox had done it was just so bad and so horrible. You never had the same announcers. You never had the time. Some races would be live, some would be tape delayed, some would be missing maybe, right? I mean, it was just, the broadcasting was all over the place. The commentary was all over the place. Everything was just all over the place. I think they did have a few people. I think they might have brought Derek Bell back. I think John Watson, the former McLaren driver, I think he was on for a little bit. I think Sam Posey, who is another, I would say, American voice of Formula One, I think he might have been on there as well. But it was just all over the place. It wasn't something that was really focused and clear. So watching Formula One, well, you were able to go online and look at information. You were able to get Autosport, F1 Racing Magazine, and other things. Just watching it was an absolute shit show. It was bad. I mean, like, really, really bad. So Speed Channel gets Formula One. Now, this is Speed Vision originally. Fox bought it and then made it into a channel. And the whole idea of this was to try to make Speed Vision like Speed World was on ESPN, but an actual channel, right? It was just going to be absolutely based on auto racing. Get all the series, even the smaller series, have shows about cars and everything. It was just a pure car and speed channel, which was beautiful. And they didn't disappoint when it came to providing F1 coverage. So even though ESPN had done decent coverage, and Fox previously had just screwed it all up, they did a horrible job, Speed Channel actually had some uniformity in what they did. So they actually had a little bit of a pre-race show. They did some post-race stuff. They actually had guys on the grid. So they originally had Peter Windsor on the grid interviewing drivers before the race. Then that eventually became Will Buxton. So, right, Will Buxton came in through Speed Channel, which is great, which is amazing. And, you know, they had Bob Varsha, David Hobbs, and I don't think he came in right away, but maybe a year or two later, they had Steve Matchett, which, by the way, Sky Sports, if you're watching, hire Steve Matchett. He is amazing. He is great. You don't have anyone that's good technically on your squad, on your team that you have right now, your broadcasting team, as Steve Matchett. Put him on there. He is friggin' amazing. So, as with all things, it came to an end. From its first form as Speed Vision, that horrible thing, and then through Fox, and then eventually Speed Channel, and then Speed, there was a good history there. From 1997 to 2012, Speed was, you know, really improving on the product, was really actually being able to show people in the United States Formula One. They were able to get involved with it. They had shows on it. You know, they really got people involved with it. They had the races live. A lot of times they actually had a tape delay if you missed it, right? They had Bob Varsha, they have Steve Matchett, they had David Hobbs, they had all the people, but eventually it was gone. And in 2013, NBC took over the rights of Formula One in the United States. And this was a worry for a lot of people, because now all of a sudden you have this TV conglomerate taking over, one of the big three names And we're wondering, well, are they going to be able to do as good of a job as Speed? Because Speed was a channel dedicated to racing and to cars and things like that. NBC is just NBC. Now, at this time, NBC had also bought the rights to the Premiership in the UK and had really started taking on international sports. So it just seemed normal that they took on Formula One. And when they took on Formula One, yeah, they did not disappoint. So in a matter of 15 years, we had gone from the worst coverage that we had ever seen in the United States when it comes to Formula One to some of the best coverage. A post-race show, a pre-race show, people on the grid, everything that we wanted. Reduced amount of commercials. So they did something called side by side where they'd have a commercial on the side, but you'd be able to see the race on the other side of the screen. This was amazing. And NBC, to me, to this day, provided the best Formula One coverage in the United States. And basically, they just took what Speed had and said, yeah, we're going to improve on that. We're going to make it better. They did not disappoint. And this is when you start seeing Formula One really start gaining speed in the United States. From the last few years of Speed through NBC, you start seeing the viewership go up. You start seeing the amount of people going to races go up. You start seeing Formula One races in the United States, right? So you start seeing the popularity go up. Why? Because people were able to see the races. NBC had a number of channels and still do today, and they were able to show replays on other channels if you missed it. Again, you had DVRs. Now the internet's so expansive you can get all the information, right? You just get Autosport online right now, right? This is why the sport started to boom here in the United States. But as is the story with everything that we've talked about, all good things come to an end. And in 2017, it was the last year for NBC to have Formula One in the United States. Then the way that it happened wasn't exactly diplomatic, all right? So basically what happened was Liberty Media just took over Formula One. They said, yep, NBC, you're not having it anymore. We're giving it to ESPN. And this actually kind of made the NBC people a little bit furious. Even David Hobbs said he was worried about the inferior quality of the Formula One coverage on ESPN. So ESPN gets Formula One. And I will admit the first time they got Formula One, when they got it from the wide world of sports and all these other little small markets back in the early 80s and really refined it into something that you could watch, this time it got a little bit lazy. So ESPN gets the rights to Formula One, and there's no announcing of who is going to be the commentary crew. Nothing. I mean, like zero. Like, are they going to be showing it? Are they not? What's going to happen? Right? We had no idea. Of course, all of us were watching our Twitter feeds. We were looking at Steve Matchett, Bob Varsha, Lee Diffie at the time, David Hobbs. Were looking at all their Twitter feeds saying, okay, you're going to bring these guys on, right? No. What did they do? They just simply took the Sky Sports feed. That was it. They just decided to just be real lazy at it and say, you know what, we're not going to have an American dedicated crew. We are just going to pick the Sky Sports crew. Okay? Now, a lot of people like myself had grown up. I mean, like literally from the time that I was 10 years old, grew up with Bob Varsha, grew up with David Hobbs, and for much of my adult life watching Formula One, grew up with Steve Matchett. So to go to this crofty guy and whatever, this was new to me. I didn't know who these people were. Now, granted, there were a lot of people I did know who they were, Martin Brundle, Damon Hill, and all the people that they have there, which is great, but I didn't know who these people were. I really didn't care. I was kind of mad that I now had to totally change. But, you know, maybe that's me being selfish. But I know there are a lot of Formula One fans in the United States that kind of felt that getting the Sky feed was a little bit of a betrayal and really looked at as not treating the Formula One market in the United States with any type of respect. So with this being the case, If any of you watched the first race on ESPN for Formula One, you remember what it was like. It was shit. Like, they would run commercials and like the middle of, like, a driver was getting ready to pass another driver for the lead. Let's just go to a commercial. They were putting commercials in random spots. I think it was like ended up being like 15 minutes late. We couldn't even see the first few laps of the race because they hadn't had it on yet. Like, I was watching ESPN and they were showing some college basketball or something like that, like some rerun from the night before. It was just really, really, really bad coverage. And they just blew it. They just did really horrible. And everyone was saying right out of the bat, they just sucked. And ESPN heard that. I will give ESPN that credit. They heard it, because guess what happened the next race? They went to no commercials. Now, this is something, so you got to realize, it took until 2018 to have a Formula One race that had no commercials. Whereas in Britain and other places where this has been the norm for many years, it wasn't the norm. So that kind of shows you how serious we had taken Formula One. But we went ahead and started having these. ESPN started doing a lot more. They had really good post-race and pre-race coverage. I mean, it was just the Sky coverage, basically, but they actually showed the Sky coverage. They actually started to really do a good job at it. And they did that for a number of years. They did that through 2019. They did that through 2020. 2021, though, last year, they got a little lazy again. What did they do? Started popping up commercials during one of the races. A lot of people complained about that, and then they stopped doing that. But now the coverage has gone back to being really bad again. There's a little bit of a pre-race show. There is basically no post-race show. They just do the podium, do the drivers up there, and that's it. That is basically all they have for post-race now. So ESPN is starting to drop the ball yet again. And again, it just shows me that they're not necessarily really taking it seriously. It's like, hey, this is something that we have an obligation to put it up. Let's just do it. Personally, I wish that ESPN would just get rid of the rights, give it back to NBC. NBC did an amazing job with it, as they do with Premiership football in England. They do an amazing job with it. It would be nice to see them get it back again. So hopefully they'll be able to get it back, because ESPN has really been screwing it up over the last few years. Now, I know this video has kind of been all over the place when it comes to talking about the broadcast history of Formula One, but that's the point. To be a Formula One fan in the United States, especially since the 1980s, has been a damn near impossible task, because just to be able to watch a race sometimes was impossible. When you have to call a restaurant at 10:30 at night to see if they have some obscure channel that is only located in Seattle, you know the sport isn't as popular in that country because you just can't see it. So when people talk about Formula One and how unpopular, popular, or whatever it is in the United States, they never take into account the history of the broadcast formula. They never take into account how difficult it is to watch Formula One in the United States. And it has been difficult. Now, luckily, we are starting to see Netflix and Drive to Survive, which I'm going to do a whole different video on that, which probably will get a lot of thumbs down, but I'll risk it. I don't care. But it's been really hard to build a fan base here, because just the availability of watching F1 or being involved with F1 or being connected to F1 has been non-existent until pretty much the last 6-7 years. Ever since NBC got it, we start seeing more and more popularity in the sport, but still, this is going to be a long road. Now, I don't think this has anything to do with business models or anything. As of right now, it just has to do with it's not an advertised sport in this country, and the ability to watch a regular race, well, you still have to get people up at 7 o'clock in the morning to watch it, because if they're not involved with the race and they don't know about it, they're not just going to randomly DVR the Belgian Grand Prix because, oh, they heard it was nice. They need to be exposed to it somehow, and that's a whole nother video for another day. But I want to make this about the broadcast history of Formula One because I think that to know Formula One in the United States, you need to know that what we had to go through in order to see these races. So thank you all very much for joining me today. I hope this was a little bit informative. I feel that it kind of went all over the place, but then when I look at the history of Formula One in the United States, it has kind of gone all over the place. So thank you all very much. Please go ahead and like, subscribe, comment. If your opinion of F1 in the United States is different, love to hear it. Just go ahead and comment down below. If you're one of those people like me, one of those old timers that used to watch it back in the day on ESPN, love to hear from you as well. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful time wherever you are in this big wide world, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.